I really like history, and like most people, I also really like music. So you can imagine how happy I was when I heard the song Horse Soldier" by Corb Lund. And if you're watching this video, you probably heard it as well. And if you haven't, you should go listen to it. It's only like 3 to 4 minutes long. Not only for you to understand, like the video that I'm going to be talking about right now, but for you to support Corb Lund himself, because he's a super cool guy. He's a Canadian folk singer. He makes really banger music besides Horse Soldier. And Horse Soldier. I gotta break it down because my lisp makes it sound all weird. It's a cool song. It's kind of like similar to "We Didn't Start the Fire" in the way that it has a bunch. It's just a bunch of historical references. But Horse Soldier specifically is historical references about horse soldiers, or just like horses and people, cavalry, mounted men in general. And I think it was super cool. But I haven't really seen anybody talk about the lyrics a lot. I think I've only seen like one website, and it was like a blog post that kind of talked about all the references in the song. So I was like, hey, might as well give it a shot at it. Make a YouTube video about all the historical references that I personally understood. Like I said, me personally, so don't take this as like super academic or anything, right? I'm just giving like a very small, maybe not 100% honest, not 100% like thorough, like breakdown of all the references. So hopefully it just like makes you like see something that you haven't really heard about. Like, oh, I really want to know more about this, or want to know about this charge or this battle or something. So hopefully it inspires you to look into more history, because history is pretty cool. To start off, the song is named Horse Soldier, and the song in its entirety is a tribute to horsemen of all history. Of course, we have soldiers, but we also have guards, we have rangers, farmers, like just anybody who really rode on horseback, and they fulfilled their duties. Many duties, from charging enemy lines, patrolling towns, and just increasing the speed of reaction from a government or an institution. The first lyrics are, alright, so we have 3 different groups here. We have the Hussars, the Huns, and the Englishmen, who were routing, or in other words, rounding up, Napoleon during the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. The Hussars are a name of Hungarian light horsemen, usually from the 1400s, but like many words, as time went on, it kind of changed in meaning into becoming just like light cavalry in general, because of how fierce they fought. So it became just like a term showing respect to light cavalrymen. So in these verses, it could have really been anyone. It could have been French, Prussian, English, even Belgian light cavalry soldiers that usually did a lot of scouting and skirmishes during the Battle of Waterloo. So it could be in reference to any one of those. But definitely not Hungarian, because from what I know, there was no Hungarian horse soldiers during the Battle of Waterloo. The second term to use is a Hun. And in simple terms, Hun is just kind of slang for German, or like a Germanic person. And it was often used by Britain and just Europe in general. This could be in reference to the Britain's King German Legion, which was a specialized cavalry division made up of primarily Germanic people that was present in the Napoleonic Wars. But I feel like it's most likely just a reference to the Prussian cavalry soldiers, who were German in language and culture, with Prussia being a precursor to Germany before it became like unified. And of course, Englishmen. I don't really have to explain that one. They're Englishmen, and these being the British light and heavy cavalry. These troops, Belgian Hussars, Russians. The giant car just like revved up right next to me. Sorry, anyways, what I was saying was that all these troops, Belgian Hussars, Prussian, Huns, and Englishmen, were all super instrumental to the Battle of Waterloo, where the Sixth Coalition was able to round up and defeat Napoleon, marking one of the major final defeats of the Napoleonic Wars, and the final defeat of Napoleon specifically. A dragoon was the name given to French cavalry soldiers, which were trained both as medium and heavy cavalry, and they fought using saber and carbines, so very like quick and mobile. And their primary duty, the primary duty was to break down enemy lines, and they were trained to go fight, charge to enemy, and then dismount and fight on foot if needed to continue the fight. Usually these were used, prominently, they were more used during 1799 to 1815, so kind of like during the Napoleonic Wars from the very beginning to the very end. A Don is just a type of horse. I can't really describe it. I don't know how to describe it that well. It has a lighter color on their neck and their body, with a darker color on their head and their mane, and like the bottom of their feet. I'll put a picture of it either way, so it's just a type of like fancy horse. A Cossack was a term given to the southern Slavic people of Russia, which usually were partially nomadic and militaristics. They usually rode around on horses. They were great cavalrymen, but they weren't really loyal to like a certain cause. But I think in reference here, it's referring to how they were inscripted into the Tsar's army, mostly as light cavalry. They were crucial in Russia's defense against France during the Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. They were known to be quick and fierce, often sabotaging, disrupting, and using guerrilla tactics against the Grande Armée, the Grand Armée, the Great Army, harassing Napoleon's forces during the campaigns to Moscow, and even attacking them on the retreat as well. They were slowly picking off of France's own cavalry. This reference is a bit more mainstream, at least in America, I think, where Custer, known as George Armstrong Custer, was the general of the 7th Cavalry of the United States of America during the Sioux Wars of 1876 to 1877, thus 76 or 77. I mean, if you want to get technical, it's from 1854 to 1890, whatever. This war was an attempt of the United States to force out and neutralize indigenous tribes of the Teton Sioux, sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names, and claim the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming, which they did. They were able to get away with this. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were widely known for Custer's Last Stand, which took place during the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876. In the battle, Lakota leader Crazy Horse, which is a crazy name, after seeing a vision, moved the majority of his forces, of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. General Custer, upon underestimating the numbers and force of Crazy Horse, launched an attack where his entire cavalry division, including himself, were killed and scalped by the entirety of the Lakota forces. Once again, we see both sides of the conflict, with the very next line talking about the death of the indigenous tribes in America. Horses were not part of indigenous culture or war tactics, at least until Europeans introduced horses to the Americas, but very soon they became one of, if not the strongest columns, besides rifles and guns of course, that strengthened indigenous forces, helping them go toe-to-toe against Americans, French, British, Russian, Spanish, and Mexican forces in America. Though, as you may know, or you should know, the indigenous forces, many of which like the Aztec, Apache, Comanche, and Sioux, and Blackfoot, and I can keep going, were warrior nations, being like heavily trained and a very heavy cultural emphasis on like fighting and being warriors. But even then, they were not able to defend against colonization and were eventually devastated and subdued by said colonizing powers. The Tears and Devastation can also be a reference to the Trail of Tears, which over 60,000 indigenous people from the 5 civilized tribes, or quote-unquote civilized tribes, that's what they called them. The 5 civilized tribes, were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations, who were displaced and forced to march on like weeks on end west of the Mississippi River to quote-unquote Indian Territory from 1831 to 1850 by orders of, United States President Andrew Jackson. He did this to open up territory in Mississippi and the southern eastern United States. Going to Asia now, we're talking about Khan, who's widely known as Genghis Khan, one of the biggest historical figures ever, because, he's mentioned in Fallout. I'm just saying, imagine. But he was. He was the founder and leader of the Mongol Empire, which conquered parts of Eastern Europe, China, Russia, and the Middle East from 1205 to 1227. After 1227, he would die, but his dynasty would continue the empire, becoming the modern-day country of Mongolia. Both Genghis Khan and his army were primarily nomadic, meaning they didn't really stay in a single place, primarily using horse soldiers, horse archers, and cavalry to quickly move and attack all of Asia. This speed was the main tactic used to shock and overwhelm the neighboring empires, but it also led to them not being able to carry many resources and not having that many well-supplied lands. Usually what they did was they would ask tribute and raid or siege towns, settlements, and that's how they would get the supplies and forces needed to continue on their march and continue having their soldiers and forces fed. Parts of Mongolia, China, and Russia made up the Mongol steppe, and the Mongol steppe is just flat, uncharted grass plains. If you see any picture of Genghis Khan or any video of Genghis Khan or the Mongols, the Mongol Empire riding, you're probably gonna see them riding on flat grasslands, and that's what's called the Mongol steppe. On their campaigns, the Mongols often rode on mares, which are female horses, and this allowed them to milk the horse for horse milk. which they would then drink or make into dishes as nutrition. This was because, like I said, they didn't really have supply lines, so the more things you could carry on the go without it affecting your speed, the better. On rare occasions, though, as food and water became, there were shortages of food and water, there was scarcity, they would often cut, or in these cases, they would cut a small vein on the side of the horse's neck, and they would put a bowl under it, and they would collect some of the horse's blood. They would get this blood and they would drink it just like that raw, or they would mix it with other food, and usually use it as an ingredient to supplement the vitamins and the food that they weren't getting. This was widely practiced, but it wasn't a common occurrence. Like I said, they would only do it on cases where they were running out of food. It was we gotta do something just so we could reach the next town over and then continue supply there. These slides are a reference to the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1922. The two main forces of the Civil War were the White Army, which was a coalition of people from differing ideologies and backgrounds who opposed the Red Army. The Red Army, who were known as the Bolsheviks, were people who fought to end the monarchy in Russia and replace it with the political and economic theory of communism, their leader being Leon Trotsky with the ideology of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Both of these armies used cavalry extensively and mounted troops as well, even though it was towards the end of the First World War, primarily because of low amount of resources, infrastructure, and stability, which made it super difficult to use modern inventions and tactics. Using rifles, carbines, pistols, and horses, the Red Army was able to overwhelm the palace's own defenses and guards, and later on being able to capture Tsar Nicholas Romanov II, Tsar Nicholas Romanov II, and his family, who were the royalty at the time in Russia, and they moved him to a secluded cabin in the woods. A bit later on, in July 1918, as the White Army attempted more attacks to bring down the communist movement, the Red Army, in fear of Tsar Nicholas and the Romanovs being seen as symbols of returning to the monarchy, decided to round up the entire Romanov family, including their 5 children, mind you, and execute them via firearms and bayonets in the middle of the night in the cabin's own basement, before burying them in unmarked graves so they wouldn't become martyrs to the movement. Going back in time again, Lund begins to talk about the Crusades and Saladin. Sultan Saladin was the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, which unified Egypt, Syria, and the Muslim Middle East against Crusaders during the Third Crusade from 1187 to 1192. Starting from small skirmishes and reconquering small towns, Sultan Saladin entered a fierce conflict with King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, who is called the Leper King. The Larper King. The religious war known as the Third Crusade ensued, with Sultan Saladin and Richard of Lionheart fighting after King Baldwin's death and Saladin reconquering Jerusalem. The Third Crusade ended with a stalemate, with Richard the Lionheart able to win coastal areas around the Middle East, but Sultan Saladin succeeding in his mission to unite Sunni Muslim countries and retake Jerusalem from Christian forces. Both Sultan Saladin and Richard of Lionheart and the Leper King primarily used cavalry because of the long stretches of land they had to both cross to meet each other's armies, but Sultan Saladin used swift, smaller Arabian horses that he used like light cavalry and mounted archers, and he used them to slowly pick away at European crusaders, who often had draft horses. The Percheron is a type of draft horse, and a draft horse is just usually a large, heavy horse, which are very slow but very strong. These were needed because the crusaders' large, heavy armored knights weighed too much for a standard horse. Because of, like I just mentioned, their slow speed and very heavy movement, many were circled and harassed to death in the desert by Sunni Muslim forces on smaller, nimbler horses that would just harass them too, until they, would eventually die. There's a pretty cool verse, kind of saying no matter the time, no matter the conflicts, again and again, horse soldier, were cast to fight horse soldier, a man in his steed against a man in his steed. Pretty cool. Formed in 1873, the Mounties, or professionally known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were the mounted police force in Canada, you can tell, which were well known for their ranger hats and bright crimson red uniforms. I'll put some pictures on screen. Often carrying Colts, rifles, carbines, they rode across Canada, helping people and just fulfilling normal police work. They exist to this day and, like I said, function as peace officers, keeping the peace, managing the Canadian firearms program, and just overall police work. Early on, they used horses to traverse rugged terrain and to have a quick reaction time, but in modern times, they kind of phased out horses for vehicles and traded their iconic crimson coats for button-up white shirts. Though they still use their red uniforms and their horses during ceremonies, nonetheless, they have a pretty rich and cool history of horse riding and helping their fellow man all throughout Canadians' territory, or Canadians' history and their territory. Staying with the Mounties, here we have a more modern event, this being the Merithorpe tragedy of 2005. In 2005, 4 Mounties named Anthony Gordon, Lionide Johnston, Brock Myrle, and Peter Scheinman were conducting a search in an isolated ranch belonging to James Rofsco, who was running a chop shop / marijuana farm. A chop shop is just a place where stolen cars would be brought in and broken down for their parts. Rofsco was not present when the search started, but he was later on, towards the end of the night, dropped off by 2 accomplices. With a pistol in his belt, a rifle in his back, and holding a semi-automatic rifle, Rofsco returned to his property, hiding in a Quonset. The Quonset is just a big storage unit container thing. I'll put one up screen as well. As the 4 constables, or the Mounties, entered the Quonset, Rofsco opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle, quickly killing Constable Gordon, Myrle, and Scheinman. Johnston, however, was able to get a shot out before being killed as well. At the sound of gunfire and screams, Constable Viger and Hoogstraat, who were outside the Quonset, investigated, with Hoogstraat falling behind to radio in the conflict. Rofsco exited the Quonset, encountering Constable Viger, and to his surprise, he fired at him. Viger was able to fire some shots at the gunman, hitting his hand and shattering his femur, before him and the gunman both retreated. Rofsco, who retreated into the Quonset, took his own life, and the 4 constables, known as the Fallen 4, were pronounced dead and are honored to this day in one of Canada's deadliest shootings. Staying in North America, but going back to 1864, we get a reference to the American Civil War, with Generals Bedford Forrest serving the Confederacy and General James Wilson serving under the Union. Bedford Forrest is considered to this day one of the best generals of the Confederacy, with his harsh and effective cavalry raids, causing many roadblocks for the Union trying to push into the southern states. Notably, to mention, he was also the chief wizard of the Triple K, and one of the strongest forces of the Confederacy. General Forrest is misquoted as saying, "To get our fastest with the mostest," by the New York Times Tribune, with his original quote saying, "Ma'am, I got there first with the most men," regarding his cavalry tactic of arriving first to the battlefield with the most men. Duh. Some say that he was purposely misquoted to make him seem less illiterate and more like southern, crazy guy who doesn't know how to talk. General James H. Wilson, on the other hand, was a Union engineer, in which he kept climbing and changing ranks, eventually becoming a general and chief of cavalry. He led a strong and fierce cavalry unit, and like mentioned in the lyrics, he was one of the few generals able to defeat Forrest twice, often deploying aggressive and fast raids in the South. His cavalry unit and himself later went on to capture President of the Confederacy Jeff Davis, ending the American Civil War. The lines here are taken directly from the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred L. Tennyson. The full poem isn't that very long, so I recommend you reading it, but I'm only going to be including the first 2 stanzas. And they say, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death, rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death, rode the 600. This is a short poem written to summarize the charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War of 1854. The Crimean War was fought with an alliance of French, English, and Ottoman forces against the Russian Empire due to disagreements on Ottoman-controlled Palestine and Orthodox and Catholic conflicts. Russia wanted the Christian Orthodox Church to have more control in Jerusalem, but the Ottoman Empire gave the power to the French Catholics. Russia, then, declared war against the Ottoman Empire, causing France and England to join against Russia. In the Battle of Balaclava, the English Light Brigade was meant to charge a Russian retreating line to prevent captured Turkish and English cannons from being taken by Russian forces. But instead, due to a miscommunication error, the entire 600-man force rode down a valley charging head-on to a heavily armored Russian cannon force. The Light Brigade was a small swift force meant to do reconnaissance and skirmishes, so just small attacks and going in and out very fast. And because of this, they wore no armor, and were armed with nothing more than pikes, lances, and sabers. The brigade was made up of mostly dragoons and hussars, with about 150 lancers. Trusting in their superiors' orders, the entire Light Brigade charged the Russian artillery batteries, being mowed down by shot after shot of Russian cannon fire from all three sides. They were shot from the front, from the left, and from the right. They suffered heavy casualties before even reaching the battery, but once they did, they were able to scatter the gunners, before having to retreat through the very same valley. While turning to retreat, many Russian gunners ran back to the cannons, where they once again fired indiscriminately at the brigade, causing even more casualties. At the end of the charge, the Light Brigade, which was made up of 600 horsemen, returned with only 198, over 400 casualties. One of England's most noble and loyal brigades, demolished for no real reason. So this reference was a bit harder to understand, but I think I got the gist of it. This isn't really a reference to any type of major historical event or singular type of horse soldier, but just the idea in general of mounted mercenaries. Swiss, for many major events and conflicts, had been neutral, but still offered many mercenary groups and services to wartime countries. Very popularly, they armed the Papal States, creating the Swiss Guard that protects the Vatican to this day. Even active wars like the 100-Year Wars and 30-Year Wars hired mercenary mounted soldiers to support their efforts. Though Swiss in of itself wasn't really known for their mounted mercenaries, more for their pike mercenaries. Many of the mercenaries didn't join war efforts because of any personal cause, instead offering their services for whoever could afford them. Hence the reference of slaying the devil, regardless of them being a Christian or a heathen, either from Swiss or from Sweden. Sweden doesn't have a history of providing mercenary services, but was very known for their fierce mounted troops. So this verse is more of a concept or the idea of cavalry for hire, instead of any real historical reference or any major historical event. In military tactics, a flanking maneuver is a tactic where a group attacks an enemy's forces from the sides instead of attacking them head-on. Ulan alles über is a mishmash of different Germanic terms, with Ulan, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Ulan, being the name of light cavalry, usually from Germany, Poland, Prussia, and Austria, that used lances and pikes. And alles über being the rearranged term of über alles, which is German for above all, or better than. Regiment of Foot is another name for infantry, usually used for English infantry, but it just means normal infantry in general. So this line is saying that some sort of light Germanic cavalry is above all, or über alles, and is striking fear into the line infantry by attacking their sides or flanking their sides. This is very general, but could be in reference to any battle where German lancers on horses attacked British troops, or just any troop in general. For example, there was many wars during World War I, where Britain went against German lancers before they were phased out by newer divisions and tactics. The song shifts themes now, slowing down and becoming more and more simple, which is what happened to the horse soldier in our reality. The eternal and omnipresent horse soldier that we have been following know their glory days are coming to an end. By 1917, the Great War, also known as World War I, had changed warfare forever. Trenches sprawled across Europe, not allowing for traditional cavalry charges, and of course cavalry wasn't phased out from one day to another, but slowly the tactic died out. After that, the mounted soldier became generally obsolete in war, with a few exceptions. Machinations de la guerre is two parts. Machinations being the general term for machines, or just machines, and de la guerre being French for of the war. So together the line says something around, I knew my time was over, when over the trenches rode modern machines of war. The song seems somber and almost melancholic. The horse soldier, the cavalry, which was present for so much of human history, wasn't a match compared to the new tactics of war. The rapid fire machine guns, the airplanes, the barbed wire, the armored automobiles outclass horses and soldiers and riders. A rearguard action is a defensive action by retreating forces. Here, the riders, knowing that their end was coming, retreated, but not before being of use one more time. During World War I and the conflicts of the era, cavalry charges died out, but horses still helped in transportation for supplies, medication, and even wounded troops as they made their leave on the battlefield. Arguably the most modern cavalry charge to this day was in 2001 by American Special Forces ODA 595, also known as horse soldiers, pretty cool, against Taliban forces in Afghanistan. After the September 11 attacks in the United States of America, where the Taliban terrorists hijacked airplanes, crashing them strategically in the Pentagon and World Trade Center, America decided to declare war against terrorist forces. This was known as the War on Terror. Before the USA was able to mobilize, they sent two special forces, those being ODA 595 and Air Force combat controllers with CIA support, to retake the city of, and sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Mazar al-Sharif in Balkh province of Afghanistan from Taliban forces. Joining the Americans were the United Islamic Front for the Salvation of Afghanistan, that is a mouthful, also known as the Northern Alliance, which had multiple commanders, but one of them mentioned here is Abdul Rasir Dastam. The coalition found it easier to go by foot and horse to retake the city, and thus chose Afghani horses to be able to traverse the terrain. They hid at the hills of the city, and after bombardment by the United States Air Force at the city's Taliban military base, Dastam called for the charge. There was about 300 soldiers in total, 150 of them, or 1,050 of them, being cavalry, and 12 of those being the American soldiers. And of course, this being in 2001, they didn't charge the Taliban forces with sabers and lances, right? But rode into trenches and shell craters towards the base while firing their assault rifles and using frag grenades. The charge was successful, with 0 American horse soldiers dead, but sadly 40 Northern Alliance volunteers died, so there was 40 casualties. They were able to drive out the Taliban forces from the base and eventually the city, killing 310 terrorists and capturing 250. We see the music swelling again. The beat picks up and the horse soldier thinks to himself one more time. No matter the time period, no matter whether they're on the winning or losing sides of battle, there will always be horse soldiers. A swelling in our ranks or a growth of our troops. No matter the situation, the history and impact of cavalry, mounted troops, and horses will never vanish. And maybe one day, they'll be used again. Little did Lund know that after 2001, horses would be used again. As of 2026, there has been various reports of mounted soldiers helping with resupplies during the Russian-Ukrainian war, as well as Russian cavalry soldiers riding into enemy territory on horseback. Maybe not traditional charges, but still evidence of mounted troops in warfare. As the song fades out, we can hear the horse soldier continue singing about the mounted troops and cavalry, giving more and more references as the song fades, almost as if he can go on forever, which is super cool. This is a reference to the Battle of Beersheba of 1917 during the First World War, which was probably the very last traditional cavalry charge, using sabers or swords. Aussies is a slang or name given to Australians, who were the troops rushing the Ottoman city of Beersheba. Australia's Mounted Division 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments charged the city with the help of New Zealand and British troops, with the purpose of setting a stronger foothold in the Middle East to better attack the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman forces were very concentrated in the regions of Judea, so the plan was to get a strong foothold in the region, then spread out from there. This was made even more urgent as the troops' water supplies were running low in the desert, and so they must capture wells that these cities had so they could continue going on their campaigns. The battle began with British, Australian, and New Zealand forces attacking with artillery and guns, forcing the Ottomans to retreat deeper into the city. At dusk, General Grant gave the orders for the brigade and the cavalry to charge the Ottoman trenches, to finally push the Ottomans out and capture the wells that they needed to resupply the troops. And so, 2 Australian divisions on horseback charged the Ottoman trenches. They either used their rifles if they were skilled enough to ride and shoot at the same time, or more commonly, they used their sharpened bayonets as short sabers. See what I mentioned, the last cavalry charge with sabers? With the bayonets being 18 inches long, which is like about 1.5 feet. American. Once reaching the trenches, many men turned jumping from the horse and doing a traditional trench raid on the Ottoman forces. The other men, however, jumped over the trenches with their horses, riding past the front lines and rode directly into the city, where they slashed any soldier they saw while screaming like madmen through the streets of Beersheba. This charge was successful in forcing the Ottomans out of the city, allowing Grant and the coalition of soldiers to capture the needed wells and continue the campaign in the Middle East. And the sick man of Europe died. Yep. This line is a reference to the myth that Polish lancers charged German tanks during the Battle of Krashenty at the start of World War II in 1939. The battle started because of German infantry that was beginning to gather at the border of Poland in preparation of the German invasion of Poland, kicking off World War II. As Polish forces saw the gathering of Germans, Colonel, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced their name, actually I'm going to search it up. As Colonel, sorry, I don't really know how to say these names, I'm going to search it up. As Colonel, never his name, as Colonel Masterles ordered Eugenius, the commander of the 8th Pomeranian Utlan Regiment, to charge the infantry. The Uhlans were equipped with mostly lances, though it is reported that they would often carry anti-tank rifles. Nonetheless, the regiment charged the German troops with lances and sabers, and were extremely successful in dispersing and making them retreat. The Uhlans were primarily deployed to disperse the German forces, but this was in hopes to buy time for the Polish infantry, the 1st Rifle Battalion, and, sorry if I mispronounced it again, Kursk operational group to retreat and regroup farther back. Sadly, as the German infantry dispersed, the Uhlans were surprised by German reconnaissance vehicles who appeared from the forest. They rode armored cars mounted with machine guns, which they then used to target at the cavalry charge. The regiment dispersed and retreated towards a small hill, but not fast enough because over 1/3 of all the mounted soldiers died, including Colonel Masteres, who died trying to retrieve Eugenius, I don't know how to say their names, I'm sorry, who was also killed. The charge was not in vain though, because the Polish rifles and infantry were able to retreat deeper, allowing them to fortify, though sadly Poland would eventually fall to the German forces. After the battle, Italian and German journalists photographed the aftermath. The scene showed horses and Polish cavalry with lances, laying dead as German tanks and armored cars rolled across the battlefield. This was quickly used as propaganda, which said that the ill-equipped and misinformed Polish forces performed a cavalry charge with lances against German tanks, thinking that the tanks were either sheet metal or dummy tanks. Okay, so there's only 2 to 3 more references left, and they're about the same war, so they should go a lot easier. Ross, known as Robert Ross, was a British general that fought in many wars, including the Napoleonic, Peninsular, and 1812. The War of 1812 started after American sailors were forcibly recruited into the British Royal Navy to help the war effort against Napoleon. This caused the United States to declare war on Britain and decided to attack modern-day Canada, which was a British colony at the time. Most of the war in the beginning was fought by militia and British troops present in Canada, who defended against American forces. Though halfway towards the war, Britain, after winning the Napoleonic Wars, was able to turn full attention to the war in the United States. That shifted the war from the United States forces attacking British to the United States forces defending against British forces, which moved through America. One of the most famous battles was the Siege of Washington in 1814, where General Robert Ross with George Cockburn, man, they know British names, man, George Cockburn, captured and burned Washington, D.C., burning the White House as well. Ross and Cockburn landed in Maryland with about 5,000 men and won the Battle of Bladensburg. Ross was convinced by Cockburn to continue moving forward and capture the city of Washington, D.C., and Ross hesitantly agreed. With 4,500 men, of those 1,000 being Royal Marines, they marched down the Maryland Avenue to Washington. Initially, Ross wanted a treaty, or a surrender to occur, to prevent any unnecessary violence, but the American troops within the capital never saw surrender as an option. As Ross and Cockburn rode into the city, the American forces responded by musket and cannon fire, which killed some men and, more importantly to the verse, shot Ross's horse from under him. At this, Ross ordered an attack against Washington, where even with the smaller forces, he was able to drive out the American holdouts, leading to him to capture the city and capital. Cockburn suggested to burn the entire city down, but Ross decided to leave the private buildings alone. rather ordering his men to burn down the Capitol building, then to loot and burn the White House as well. Alright, we made it to the last reference, this one also being during the War of 1812. The last reference of the song fades out as the Battle of York in 1813, also during the Battle of 1812 like I just mentioned. A year before Washington burned, the United States actually burned down the capital of the Canadian British colony, which was York, modern-day Toronto. In this battle, the United States forces mustered out 14 armored boats of various types, as well as 1,700 soldiers, including the 1st American Rifles, a specialized sharpshooter regiment meant to take down the generals and heads of armies. As they began to move to York, they stayed partially away until desirable conditions. British Canada, at receiving the information of the siege, began to prepare, making defenses and raising militias, and making treaties with the Ojibwe? I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing this. I'm mispronouncing a lot of names. Ojibwe natives, who saw the British as the better option rather than being annexed by the United States, who did want to annex most of the Canadian territory. A couple days later, 300 American troops landed, with the boats providing artillery support with their cannons. The force that faced the Americans in the initial landing were only the Ojibwe, I don't know how to pronounce that, natives, which were beaten back before British troops came with the support of General Roger Hale Sheaffe, who sent the regiment to help. I'm just noticing I'm mispronouncing a lot of names. That's fine. It probably isn't. Like, I'm only doing this so you guys could go on and study these own topics on your own time. I'm just giving you guys like a thumbnail to these events. But yeah, General Roger Hale Sheaffe sent a regiment to help. Unfortunately for Sheaffe, the bombardment by American ships was too much for his forces, which were flanked and forced to retreat with the Ojibwe warriors, as more and more American troops landed, led by Brigadier General Zebulon Montgomery Pike. More fighting ensued as American forces marched down to York Fort, as the American ships continued to offer artillery. Eventually, General Sheaffe, sensing the impending loss, decided to retreat his forces, abandoning the citizens and militia of York, with the simple orders of getting the best terms they could when the Americans eventually broke in and conquered. As General Sheaffe and his forces retreated from the fort, he ordered his men to burn down the bridge over River Don to slow down the Americans, or the Yanks, as well as ordering the burning of the HMS, or His Majesty's ship, Sir Isaac Brock, which was under construction so the Americans wouldn't capture it. As a final screw you to the Americans, he rigged the fort's magazine to explode. Eventually, the American forces led by General Pike, who were unaware of the British retreat, were prepping to siege the fort. Then, the magazine went off. The explosion killed General Pike, 37 soldiers, and gravely injured over 200 men. As revenge, the other generals and the soldiers sacked and raided the capital, citizens' homes, buildings, and the fort, before eventually burning down the Legislative Assembly and the Government House, where the governor lived, but he wasn't present at the time. I could not find any references to cavalry or mounted soldiers in this specific battle or siege, because it was mostly an amphibious landing, but there very well could have been a general or soldier who had a horse, mostly after the siege. And Sons of Ying just being a reference to the soldiers who at this point were the children of the original American Revolutionary soldiers who were called Yankees during the American Revolutionary War. With that, the song ends, leaving with the sense that the song could keep going on forever and ever and ever, and it very well could. There's countless more battles and events of men and women from all throughout history riding on their loyal mounts. From Joan of Arc on her white steed, the California Lancers attacking the Americans, Zapata's Revolutionary Cavalry galloping to the capital, Mafulu charging the Eight Nation Alliance, and many, many more.